There aren't many theories in the world of Tolkien that haven't actually been addressed by Tolkien himself. If you look at his writing beyond The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, you can find an entire encyclopedia worth of knowledge about Middle-earth and the different races therein. Thanks to Tolkien's Silmarillion and Christopher Tolkien's work assembling the histories of Middle-earth, we know itty-bitty details like where did trolls come from, and who made the Misty Mountains, and where exactly did Sauron come from. All of which I've covered in other videos that are either published or soon to be published, so if you're curious, go ahead and check those out. But there's one thing that Tolkien didn't give a sufficient answer to, and a fan theory about it makes enough sense to me that I think it might actually be true. But before we get to that theory, let's look at the question that inspired it. The question is, where did hobbits come from? The question is actually a bit harder to answer than you'd expect. When it comes to the sentient creatures on Middle-earth, they were all created, they didn't arise from evolution. That means elves, men, dwarves, ents, and orcs all arose from an act of creation, although Tolkien kind of, changed his mind about the orcs a time or two. You see, at the very beginning, the supreme god of the universe, Eru Illuvatar, either directly created all of these different beings, as he did with elves and men, or he helped his angelic children, the Valar and the Maiar, create them, which is how dwarves and ents came about. Orcs were actually experiments conducted by Melkor, who was one of the Valar who fell to evil. Whether the orcs were created from elves, as the Silmarillion claimed, or something else, as Tolkien would later suppose, has never been settled, and it's one mystery that's been left unanswered in the time since Tolkien's death. But if every being was created and there was no need for evolution, how did the hobbits come into being? How did the relatively tall race of human beings develop into becoming the dwarves? From the canon, we only know that hobbits are supposed to be descended from men, but that doesn't really make sense, at least not to me. And that's where this fan theory comes in, because there's one fan theory that answers this question, and I kind of want to vote that we swap out Tolkien's original statement on hobbits' origins and use this instead. Before we get to it, let's try to set up the story a bit. What makes the hobbits different from other species on Middle-earth? Why do they need to have a very unique lineage, a different creation story than everybody else? Well, it's because they're so much more different than everybody else. They've got to come from a different place than just simple men. For one, hobbits are remarkably resilient to evil temptations. Just compare Boromir's dealing with the One Ring of Power with Frodo or Sam. They're also extremely short in stature, much shorter than any man, elf, or orc on Middle-earth. And they actually have much longer lifespans than your average man, living to 100 years of age as an average. Well, if hobbits are supposed to be descended from men, who were the second children of Ilúvatar, that means that they were the second sentient creatures that the great creator of Tolkien's universe had intended to make, then it would have been extremely tough for hobbits to have evolved from men. We've already mentioned that there really isn't a strong case for evolution in Middle-earth, but more than that, hobbits probably arose at the end of the Second Age or the beginning of the Third Age. By that point, men had only been around for about 5,000 years, which, is just far too short for a species to evolve, even if the rules of natural selection existed in Tolkien's universe. So, let's get back to my fan theory. What exactly does it have to say about the origin of the hobbits? The theory goes that after the Battle of Gladden Field, when Sauron's surviving forces ambushed Isildur and killed him and almost all of his men, that a few Dunedain fled, and those who managed to survive met nearby dwarves, perhaps fell in love, fathered a few children, and gave rise to hobbits. This would explain a lot of different things, besides it kind of being a wild fan theory. It just makes a lot of sense. This would explain why the hobbits were so resistant to the evil of the rings. Dwarves were initially designed in the darkest days of Middle-earth, when Sauron's master, Melkor, had destroyed the two lamps and only the stars lit the skies. Aule, the god of smithing, created the dwarves out of stone and dirt and made them especially strong in order to survive against the monsters Melkor was breeding in his deep dungeon of Autumnal. All of those different things that went into making the dwarves also made them extremely resilient to the ring's temptations. And the combination of the Dunedain and dwarf heritage would also explain why hobbits live so much longer than average men. And, the most obvious reason for this fan theory is the Dunedain part of the hobbits' heritage is why they appeared so mannish in face and body proportions, and their dwarf heritage would explain why hobbits were so short. I really love this fan theory. I think it's kind of a wacky one because we've never heard of a half-human, half-dwarf before, but I think it shouldn't be thrown out the window. There are plenty of half-elven, half-human characters in The Lord of the Rings, so it really isn't that far-fetched for the hobbits to be half-dwarf and half-human as well. Now, this isn't my own fan theory, as I mentioned before. We have to thank Reddit user Postmodest for this one. He or she proposed it a while back, and it hasn't really picked up much steam, probably because hobbits and their origins are one of the last mysteries in Middle-earth, but I really liked it, so I'd really love it if this was kind of explained in the Amazon series a bit. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below.